We've examined how a negotiator develops and presents his position in such a way that the opposing party believes the negotiator is firmly committed to a course of action. There are several reasons why doing this strengthens a negotiator's leverage. First, showing resolve is by itself an effective method of persuasion. Second, commitment or a tough stance at the beginning of negotiations is a commonly accepted way of doing business at a bargaining table. Being conciliatory at the start and getting tough later on will often create anger and resentment in an opponent. Third, starting firm gives a negotiator the leverage of exploring and testing the opposing party's positions, aspiration level, and intentions. And fourth, a committed stance at the start increases the likelihood that the opposing party will make the first concession. However, there's another side to the coin, and that's flexibility. And this gets to yet another critical bargaining skill, being able to show resolve and commitment, yet remain flexible. A negotiator has to remain flexible enough so that he can reduce his aspiration level if his initially committed position becomes untenable or unrealistic. Flexibility also allows the negotiator to increase his demands if either the opposing party starts imposing extreme demands or resorts to threats, or if during negotiations some unanticipated action or new information justifies or allows a negotiator to increase his demands. So flexibility in many ways minimizes the risks of leading into a win-lose negotiation, which raises the following question, which I asked Dr. Jeffrey Rubin. How can negotiators communicate that their position is flexible without making actual concessions to the opposing party?
All right, now it seems to me that the answer here involves remembering that in bargaining it takes two to tango. For an agreement to be reached, both people must be involved and both people must make some sort of move. So the way to create the impression that one is willing to make concessions while at the same time retaining one's flexibility, it seems to me, is to make contingent statements in bargaining. For one person to say to another, not, I will give you what you want, but rather, if you do something that I would like, then I will do something that you will like. That is, letting the other person know that one is willing to make concessions, but only if the other person responds in a way that you deem desirable. This can be done in the form of a promise, as when one person says to another, if you do something that I would like, then I will respond by doing something that you would like, or it can be done in the form of a threat, namely, unless you do something that I deem important, I will respond in a way that you find unattractive or undesirable. More generally, it seems to me important to keep in mind that to retain one's flexibility in bargaining while at the same time creating the impression that one is willing to make concessions, any communication that one person directs to another should probably contain the following sorts of elements. A statement of one's intention, what it is that you intend to do vis-a-vis the other. A statement of expectation, what it is that you expect the other person to do. And finally, a statement of sanction, what it is that you will do to the other should the other behave in the way that you would like, and what you will do to the other should the other behave in a way that you disapprove of. If you can find some way in your communication with another to incorporate these three elements of intention, expectation, and sanction, then I think you will have gone a long way to communicating contingency, a willingness to make concessions, while at the same time holding on to some flexibility.
To examine further how negotiators maintain flexibility, I asked both Dr. Rubin and Mr. Colson how to make a concession without giving the impression to the opposing party that if they applied more pressure, the negotiator would be willing to grant further concessions. Or as it was put earlier, how to build up to giving a concession so that your opponent doesn't believe that there are more cookies in the cookie jar? First, the response to this question from Dr. Rubin, and then Mr. Colson.
Well, this goes back to something I was talking about earlier. It seems to me it's terribly important that a negotiator start tough. Start tougher, in fact, than he actually intends to be. And then make concessions from this initial tough, intransigent posture, make concessions slowly and perhaps grudgingly, trying to coordinate his concessions with the other's behavior. Now, you may ask, why should a bargainer try to coordinate his concessions with the other's behavior? In order to create the impression that his behavior is contingent on the others, his behavior is tied to the others. That is, you as a negotiator should attempt to create the impression that you are making concessions, not because you're a soft, weak, that you're making concessions not for that reason, but rather because the other person has behaved in such a way that your concession now seems an appropriate thing to do. So what I'm suggesting here is the best way to go about making concessions is to make them slowly and grudgingly, and to gear them, to tie them, to time them to the behavior of the other party, so as to lead the other person, whether this is in fact correct or not, nevertheless, to lead the other person to believe that your behavior is tied to his behavior.
In making concessions, do you have any suggestions or rules or methods by which to make concessions so that you can indicate to your opponent that you're willing to compromise or bargain, but are not willing to give away the whole pie?
There are a large number of ways to state, to kind of tease about concessions. Certainly one rule is not to make them too quickly or too frequently. Make them grudgingly, and never make two in a row. I mean, that's obvious. Otherwise, you bid against yourself on the way down to the basement. But there are ways of saying, well, let's set that one aside until we talk about the other issues. Or maybe we could consider that, but we certainly want to get the other things taken care of first. You kind of put it on a shelf. If you say it in the right way, then the union gains the impression that it's up there on the shelf ready for them. Or if you say it in a slightly different way, and this comes back to the question of communications. Really, by your tone of voice and by your words, you can give the impression that this may be acceptable or this will be completely unacceptable.
Another important part of the bargaining process is how to persuade or force the opposing party to modify its position. I asked Mr. Colson and Dr. Rubin to describe the sources of leverage and the methods by which this is accomplished. First, the response to this question by Mr. Colson, and then Dr. Rubin. Bob, what types of methods do you use to get the opposing party to modify its position?
Major method is to threaten an impasse, a breakdown in the negotiating process. If you presume that the other party wants a contract, wants to reach an agreement, by threatening to break off negotiations, you in effect can usually get something moving. A union will use the threat of a strike. A company will use a threat of no contract, and basically the threat of forcing the union into a strike. In commercial negotiations, in a situation where the parties don't have to do a deal, the major movement technique is to break off the discussions, possibly to say that there are other people interested in the property. And this, of course, has to be done in such a way as it's believable. Basically, what you're talking about is coming up with some device that's appropriate in the particular negotiation, such as to put pressure, to put a power lever to work against the other party. In some cases, of course, the sheer logic of the advocate's position, the persuasion, can in fact move an opponent to make a concession, or psychological pressure. I mean, there are many times when a psychologically stronger, more psychologically powerful advocate is dealing with a weaker person that you can just basically, by the force of personality, force the other person down. Of course, that's risky because if you do that too directly, and there's a sense of humiliation or of anger or a desire of the weaker negotiator to get out of the situation, you may find that you have caused a breakdown in negotiations, and that may not be your object. So that has to be done in a very delicate and sensitive way.
What can negotiators do to get the opposing party to modify its position?
Okay, I think there are several things that a negotiator can do. Let's make the assumption that we have an adversary who seems to be locked into a particular posture and seems unwilling to modify his position. You've made a series of offers. The other person seems not to be responding to them. What can you do? Well, first of all, you could try to sweeten the kitty by coupling your offers with some promises, letting the other person know that, as I say, that you'll sweeten the kitty. Should the other person come around and budge from his intransigent stance, that you'll give him some side payment. You'll give him something that he would like. And conversely, you can let the other person know that unless he shapes up and begins to budge from his apparently unmodifiable position, that you're going to become increasingly unmodifiable yourself in your own position. You will refuse to make any further concessions. You can even threaten to begin making negative concessions. That is, for each occasion on which your adversary persists in not budging, you can threaten to become even less conciliatory than you were before. If you were asking for 10 units, the other person says, well, I won't let you have it, and you can let him know that unless he concedes, on the following occasion you'll now demand 12 units, and then 14, and then 20, and then 50. The longer he goes without yielding to you, the more difficult it's going to be to reach agreement, because the more intransigent your own position is going to become. Secondly, you can attempt to move an apparently unmovable adversary by persuading him that your face, your image, your good name is somehow on the line. That only he, by making concessions, can prevent you from being split asunder and spread all over the streets. Related to this is the third recommendation, and that is that you acknowledge the fact that the other person's face is on the line. Why is, after all, is he not budging? Perhaps he has more at stake to lose than you've understood at first. Perhaps there are intangible issues as well as tangible issues at work here. If you can find some way to help the other person to not lose face, if, for example, you can, without great loss or cost yourself, can make a concession that allows the other person to feel more manly, more macho, more effective, he may be able to and may be willing to reciprocate by making a concession on a tangible issue that you're in pursuit of.
Could you give me some examples of what you mean by intangible issues?
Yes, a bargainer's concern with how tough he looks. As I said earlier, I think bargainers want to feel that they are competent and capable and effective, and they want to avoid feelings of looking foolish. This is an intangible concern, and it's one that's likely to be at work in almost any bargaining relationship, but I think particularly likely to be prominent in a relationship in which one person appears to have an unmodifiable position, and you now wish to move that person. Your adversary here probably is especially concerned with intangible sorts of issues. Now, one of the ways you can make it more likely that an intangible issue will be resolved without great cost to yourself is to, if it seems appropriate, to seek the services of a third party. That is, a conflict resolution specialist who is brought in, evaluates the situation, and presumably makes some recommendation concerning resolution of the conflict. Suppose that a mediator steps into a dispute between two bargainers who appear to have reached the point of no return and appear to be on the skids. The third party recommends a particular solution. Your adversary may now be willing to make the concession that he was otherwise unwilling to make, because the concession has been requested by the third party, who in his legitimate position of authority as a third-party specialist, a conflict resolution specialist, has said, please, gentlemen, won't you help out by making some concession? Now, by agreeing and going along and making this concession, the adversary is doing so not because he's weak and foolish. He's doing so rather because he's been asked to do so. So a concession that he was unwilling to make earlier because of the risk that it may convey about how he looks and the consequences this might have in subsequent negotiations with the other party, he can now afford to make these concessions because, after all, it's been asked of him. He's being a good Joe. He's doing what the system calls for, and he's not a sissy or a fool. It seems to me, to sort of summarize what I was trying to get at before, Ed, I think that what negotiators need to do in order to get their opponent to modify his position is to really to do two things. First of all, to convey the impression in whatever means is possible that they themselves are willing to make concessions if the other person does so. That is, that my behavior is contingent on your behavior. Thus, in order for me to modify your position, I should convey to you the fact that we are interdependent, that we can only reach agreement if both of us agree to do so. That I will make a concession if you do so as well, and only under those conditions. That's the first point. Secondly, I think it's extremely important that in order to induce concessions from another, it's important that a negotiator somehow manage to instill in his adversary a sense of self-respect and confidence. A skillful negotiator is a person who is able to lead his adversary to believe that he is a competent and effective bargainer. Thus, when the adversary makes concessions, the adversary is doing so because he wants to, he chooses to, rather than because he's been pushed into a corner and has been coerced into adopting a position that he would otherwise prefer to avoid.
Much of our discussion so far has centered on a dilemma all negotiators face, and also what each negotiator is searching for as an ideal bargaining strategy. Specifically, how to develop and communicate his position in such a way that the opposing party believes he is firmly committed to a course of action, yet still leaves him enough room to reduce his demands when they become untenable. Many of the elements of how to reach this ideal and to deal with the dilemma of being both committed and flexible is accomplished through making concessions effectively. Several guidelines for making concessions have been described by our speakers. First, start with high aspiration levels to give yourself room to negotiate, and always have good reasons for starting where you have set your goals, and also have good reasons for being able to retreat from your initial position. Second, get the other negotiator to present his position before you respond. This includes learning as much as possible about what arguments and what leverage your adversary intends to use. Through questioning of the other negotiator or through informal communication channels, try to gain as much information about what the other party considers to be a realistic settlement range and what your adversary will settle for as a minimum. The more a negotiator knows about the other party, the greater the leverage to counter his moves and demands. Conversely, keeping your position and arguments hidden prevents your opponent from gaining the same advantage. Third, make contingent statements when bargaining. Let your opponent know that you're willing to make a concession only when the opposing negotiator concedes on something you want. In other words, make every concession contingent on something in return. Get something back for every concession you give, and never make two in a row. In making these statements, communicate what you intend to do to the other party in terms of what you are willing to concede, what you expect the other person to concede, and what the consequences will be to the opposing party if they comply or do not comply with what you want. Another part of making contingent statements is a fourth guideline. In making these statements, body language, the tone of a negotiator's voice, and certain commonly accepted phrases like, "let's put it on the shelf," or "we'll consider your request later," play an important part in conveying and giving concessions. The guideline here is to be aware of these hidden messages and learn how to use them in the bargaining process. Build up to making a concession is a fifth guideline. Much of effective concession making is in your bargaining posture, the strength and resolve a negotiator displays during the bargaining process. Negotiators must create the impression that they are making concessions not because they are vulnerable, but because the opposing party has responded in a way so that your concession now seems appropriate. A sixth guideline: look for ways for convincing your adversary that your hands are tied either by your constituency or because your resources are limited, or in any way that you are under extreme pressure, as a way of demonstrating that you cannot make any further concessions. A seventh guideline: look for ways to help the opposing negotiator not lose face. Help the other negotiator protect his self-image and treat him with respect or in any way to make him look good to his constituency. This can also include helping the other side in making hard decisions by providing your adversary with information or the professional assistance of a third party, which could include the services of a lawyer or accountant to help the opposing negotiator feel more secure and confident about the decisions he has to make. These types of concessions give nothing away or cost very little, but which give satisfaction to the other side. The eighth and final guideline is don't use up all your concessions. You may need a concession to break a stalemate. The negotiating process as a result of the complexity of moves and counter-moves often results in unanticipated consequences. I asked Mr. Gentile why tactics often backfire and how negotiators can minimize their negative effects and how they can sometimes use them to their advantage. In the negotiating process, I would imagine that sometimes your strategies and your tactics backfire. Something happens which is unanticipated.
Yes.
What are some common causes of those unanticipated consequences?
A couple of the causes are that you misread the other person's intentions. It's the old example that I gave to you that when you had reached what you thought was an agreement in principle, but in your mind was an orange and his mind was a grapefruit. And then all of a sudden, a couple of days down the road, when you try and take something that you've agreed to in concept or in principle and reduce it to writing, that's when it comes out. Hey, I had in mind an orange. You said you agreed with me, and that's what I said. Wait a minute, I said this. That's where something backfires, where you have a tentative agreement. The agreement is reached on a conceptual, philosophical basis, and then when you try and reduce it, you find you really didn't have an agreement. Or you assume that the other side understands, or you make certain assumptions, and those assumptions are not true. And you get down to the end and you find that you don't have an agreement. And yet both sides, from their own perspective and their own frame of reference, feel that there was an agreement. And that's catastrophic. Because that brings into question integrity, brings into question that basic, essential factor that I talked about earlier, trust.
How do you react to those unanticipated events?
Well, It depends on whether you want a settlement, want to work out an understanding, or whether you just want to throw your hands up and tell them to hit the bricks, or fire your best shot, or we'll bite the bullet, do whatever you want to do. If you really truly want to reach agreement and that happens, you immediately want to diffuse the emotional part of it and simply say, okay, maybe there was a misunderstanding. We certainly didn't try and sandbag you. We had no intent to play games with you of the language. There's an honest disagreement. Point out where there probably was the disagreement and where the railroad, where the train went off the track, so to speak. And bring it back on track and go forward on that basis. Or you might want to meet informally with the other spokesman, say, I'd like to caucus with my group to make sure that that's our understanding, and why don't you do the same? And then you go caucus, and then maybe you'll call up the opposing spokesman and say, can I talk? You can get in the hall and say, hey, I think we really blew it. I think I admit I blew it. Don't be bashful about it.
Are there ways to exploit your opponent's strategy when it backfires?
Depends if you want to exploit it.
How do you do it if you want to?
Well, by simply pointing out that, hey, I'm sorry, if you don't know what you're doing, that's too bad. Or pointing out, you agreed to it. Now, I can't help it if you're going to backtrack on it, and in a sense try and divide and conquer his team, cause dissension among the other bargaining team by pointing out that this person had agreed and yet here they're reneging on their agreement, and therefore a lot of negative connotations. Maybe our whole relationship is destroyed, and if you know the other team and know that they don't want to have that destroyed, you have effectively, to put it quite bluntly, castrated the spokesman. But at the same time, when you castrate this spokesman and make him impotent as a leader, you've created anarchy on the other side unless there's another spokesman to take over. And besides that, the person that is the recipient of that type of action is going to respond in kind, so look out, you're going to get it.
I'd like to look at some tactics for operating under win-lose conditions. We've talked about intimidation and the use of threats. How useful are delaying and disruption tactics? How do you use them effectively?
Well, dilatory tactics are always helpful, particularly if you don't really want to reach that ultimate economic confrontation. Time has a way of healing, and it does at bargaining. If you really have reached the Donnybrook, say, hey, let's stop talking for 3 or 4 days. Let's go back and review our respective positions. Maybe you've got some areas you might be able to compromise on. And let's part for 3 days. Let's get away from it for a while. That's one approach. Another approach is just simply the marathon negotiations where you wear each other down with 48-hour straight hours, and you get so tired, and I have done this, and it's been done to me, that you'll just about agree to anything because you're tired after 48 to 56 straight hours at the bargaining table. You're just tired, and sometimes that's what it takes. That's another strategy. Wear them down by that mechanism. Delay, of course, is like I said, is oftentimes a very good healing balm for a ruptured bargaining environment. No question about it. I might add parenthetically that disruption is a helpful tool if you ever get waltzed into a box canyon. One of the old bargaining techniques I learned from a union negotiator way back, that you always have a person sitting next to you who is not really the spokesman, but it's usually somebody who's the emotional person. And when you get yourself waltzed into a box canyon, hopefully you realize it. At that point, you take and you kick him in the knee, and he'll immediately go into an emotional tirade about whatever you're talking about. You say, hey, we got to have a caucus on our side. I got to calm down my team. And this person is the emotional person. So you get your caucus, go out, and then you come back and you start on another point. Oftentimes the other skilled negotiator will say, hey, wait a minute, we were on this. Well, I think we've talked enough about it, but at least you've got yourself out of box canyon. That's how disruption can be used as a positive tool. But it's tricky to use disruption, because when you start to use disruption, you get into emotion.
Another important dimension of negotiating for compromise settlements is how to break a stalemate. I asked both Dr. Rubin and Mr. Hank Calero for alternative ways for handling impasses during negotiations. First, Dr. Rubin. When it really gets down to stalemates, What are some methods that negotiators can use to break a stalemate?
Well, there are lots of ideas here, and I won't attempt to cover the whole terrain, but let me mention a couple of things. First of all, if things really do stalemate, it may be a good idea to advise the negotiators to leave the scene, to get out of the scene of the disaster, the smoke-filled room, ashtrays lined with cigarette butts, and to go away for a while and come back later. The mere passage of time often seems to help ease some of the wounds that have been inflicted one on the other. Another bit of advice, perhaps cheap advice and advice that's not easy to implement, is to urge the negotiators who have reached an impasse and are in a stalemate to try to strip themselves of their constituencies as much as possible. I think often stalemates occur not simply because the bargainers have postures that they truly believe are the correct postures to adopt, but because these postures are coupled with considerable amount of social pressure applied to them at the hands of their constituencies. I think it's a truism that one's constituency typically wants a negotiator to take a tougher stance than negotiators themselves want. The spokesman for a union, the spokesman for management, are typically in this position. They may privately be willing to reach some agreement, but may be unable to do so because their constituency, the union membership that elected this spokesman, are pushing them to drive for a tougher and better and firmer agreement. And of course, management may be doing exactly the same thing on its part. So if it's somehow possible to modify the situation in such a way that the constituencies are less salient in their role.
Have you seen any methods by which this is done?
Well, the only idea that comes to mind really in this regard is one that involves modifying the physical structure, the physical arrangement of the negotiations. Instead of perhaps having the negotiations take place on TV, as has occurred, when union management disputes are being covered constantly by the media and as a result are being witnessed by management constituency and labor constituency. If the proceedings can move into the private sequestered quarters of one of the parties or some other party, then I think the sort of prominent pressure of the constituencies is likely to be reduced. Which gets me to another sort of suggestion, and that is that if a stalemate has been reached, it may be advisable for the parties to try to negotiate on some sort of neutral turf. Perhaps the negotiations have inadvisedly been taking place on one party's turf or on the other's. If so, it may make a lot of sense to change the ground and move into a terrain that is not thought of as belonging to one of the two parties. Related to this is the idea that I mentioned earlier of moving to a setting that's not particularly associated with the bad feelings that led to the stalemate. If the negotiations have been taking place in a posh room with a green felt tablecloth, perhaps it's time to move down to the Coke machine and carry on the conversation there.
Have you ever faced a stalemate, for example, in a situation?
Oh, yes, many times.
How do you break those stalemates?
Oh, there's a variety of ways. Sometimes a stalemate is a very healthy thing. It's a way of people saying, I have to reconsider. I'm in no position to make any agreements in principle, much less reach a settlement, so it's time to think. Sometimes the stalemate can best be handled by just having a caucus. Sometimes a stalemate can be handled by making a disclosure. Throwing out something to get. Sometimes a stalemate can be handled by getting, when you get to the position where it's time for you to go in and offer something and get something. And any number of other things. The most important thing is that one thing you don't want to do is to get up and leave. Save that as the last resort. That's the last alternative.
Hank, are there any other ways that you could recommend for handling an impasse?
Well, and a couple other ways would be to recap. I find sometimes people get in an impasse and they don't, it's someone like not knowing what the next step is in the ritual. And the next step in the ritual calls for people to recap or to summarize before you can proceed and go on anywhere else. And it hasn't been done. Neither side is doing it. And yet no one knows why it's not being done. So recapping, to summarize what you've discussed, what you've agreed to, or what your problems are, or whatever. Another way of getting, possibly breaking stalemate is to get an agreement in principle, which again doesn't tie anybody down specifically to terms and conditions, but it does bridge you. As an example, I might say, well, despite the length of time that we've had here, we haven't come to any agreements whatsoever. Can we agree in principle that we want to do business together? Get it?
Mm-hmm.
And we do agree in principle we want to do business together. What we are at different loggerheads, is the terms and conditions and what it's going to cost. So that might do it. Another way of sometimes of breaking an impasse is to get a quick close. Okay, Ed, will you take $49,000 for it? And I just throw something out and just a quick, simple close, and usually extend the hand at the same time. And that's probably maybe sometimes that's all a person's been waiting for. Another way sometimes of breaking the impasse is just to physically get up from the table and to go up to a blackboard. And without saying anything, just go up to the blackboard, flip chart, and then draw on the blackboard chart your position, their position, to illustrate the differences. And sometimes the numbers or the positions are not as far apart as you think they are when you're verbalizing them when you put them up on the board.
Yes, I've seen that. Yes, that's
And
effective.
that sometimes works. And then, of course, sometimes it's worthwhile to just change locations. It's time to change locations.
Go to
You
a
know,
different room.
Go to a different room. Go out to lunch. Go take some coffee. And there's just some. But again, I think the emphasis is the final alternative is leaving or calling it off.
Have you ever been in a negotiating situation where your desires to seek a win-win solution were being undermined by your opponent?
Yes, recalling back on some things that I've done that worked well for both of us, I told the person exactly how I felt. I told him that, look, despite what I've been willing to offer, despite you still keep saying no, I don't think, no matter what I offer, would you be willing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, there are some occasions when people said, well, that's not true. By their actions, they supported their positions. That is, that they changed from a position of being very unresponsive to being one more supportive and cooperative, because they had to back up their words. And then there have been some occasions when people said, that's exactly right. And that's when the time comes that negotiators have to get up and leave. When a negotiator gets up and leaves, he has to face the same thing that pilots have long about. Do you fly an aircraft?
No, I don't.
Pilots that fly aircraft have a saying, and they say, there are those that have and those that haven't yet. And by that they mean pilots that haven't yet landed with the landing gear up. And among negotiators, I feel, there are those that have eaten it and those that haven't eaten it yet. And I mean crow.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't taste very good, but you have to eat it at least once. And I've eaten it many times. So when those positions face themselves and it still doesn't work, you're faced with having to get up and leave. And then if you leave, you may have to eat crow. And baked, roasted, spiced, he's never tasted good.